The first time I met Scott, my new stepdad, I didn't know how to feel. Mom had married him quickly. Too quickly, if you ask me. My father had been gone for only a year. And while I couldn't begrudge her happiness, Scott's presence in our lives felt like an uninvited intrusion. I was 19 and home for summer break, hoping to reconnect with Mom, only to find her world revolving around a man I barely knew. Scott was 42 tall and effortlessly charming in a way that made people lean closer when he spoke. He had a way of commanding attention without trying, a quality I found both intriguing and unsettling. His piercing blue eyes always seemed to be looking for something beneath the surface, as if he could see parts of me I wasn't ready to show. "Liam, good to finally meet you," he said the day I arrived, his firm handshake accompanied by a smile that lingered just long enough to feel personal. "Your mom's told me all about you." "Wish I could say the same," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. His grin didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. Mom, oblivious as ever, beamed between us. "You two are going to get along great. Scott's been dying to meet you, Liam. He even cleared his schedule this weekend, so we could all spend time together." But we didn't last long. 2 days after I arrived, Mom left for a business trip, leaving Scott and me alone in the house. The silence between us was palpable at first, broken only by the occasional clink of dishes or the faint hum of the television. I spent most of my time in my room, scrolling through my phone or staring out the window, wondering why I felt so uneasy around him. He wasn't rude or overbearing. Quite the opposite, actually. Scott went out of his way to make me feel comfortable, offering to cook dinner, asking about college, even pretending to care about my plans for the future. And yet, there was something about him that put me on edge. One evening, I came downstairs to find him sitting on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand and the soft glow of the TV casting shadows across his face. He looked up as I entered the room, his smile warm and inviting. "Hey, Liam," he said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "Join me?" I hesitated. There was nothing inherently wrong with the offer, but the way he said it, low and deliberate, made my skin prickle. Still, I sat down, keeping a safe distance between us. "You're quiet," he observed after a moment. "Your mom said you were outgoing." "She said a lot of things," I replied, my voice clipped. Scott chuckled, the sound low and rich. "Fair enough. I'm guessing this isn't exactly how you wanted to spend your summer." "No offense, but no. None taken," he said easily. "I get it, Liam. I'm not trying to replace your dad or anything. I care about your mom, and I want us to get along." His sincerity caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw him not as the interloper who disrupted my family, but as a man trying to find his place in an already complicated dynamic. "I'll try," I said finally, the words feeling heavier than I expected. "Good," he said, his smile returning. "That's all I ask." As the days went on, our interactions grew less strained. We found common ground in small things, a shared love for classic rock, a mutual disdain for reality TV. And while I wouldn't say we became friends, the tension between us started to ease. But then there were the moments I couldn't explain, like the way his hand would linger on my shoulder a beat too long, or the way his gaze would trail after me when he thought I wasn't looking. Little things that, on their own, meant nothing but together formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. One night, as I was heading to bed, he stopped me in the hallway. "Liam," he said, his voice softer than usual. I turned to face him, my pulse quickening. "You're a good kid," he said, his eyes holding mine. "I'm glad you're here." The words were innocuous enough, but the way he said them, low and deliberate, like a secret meant just for me, made my stomach twist. "Thanks," I muttered, stepping past him and closing my bedroom door behind me. Alone in the dark, I tried to shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Scott wasn't just my stepdad anymore. He was something else entirely, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what. The rain began just as night fell, tapping softly against the windows like an uninvited guest. I was sprawled across the couch in the living room, flipping through channels without interest. Scott walked in, carrying a steaming mug, his hair still damp from the shower. He wore a simple white t-shirt and gray sweatpants, but there was something about the way they clung to his frame that made it hard not to notice him. "Coffee?" he asked, holding out the mug. I shook my head. Not a fan. Tea then? Hot chocolate. Something to take the edge off a dreary night. His voice was light, but there was a weight behind his words that made me look at him twice. No, thanks, I said, forcing my eyes back to the TV. Scott sat down beside me, closer than he usually did. The space between us was minimal, and I could feel the warmth radiating off him. My throat tightened. What are we watching? He asked, leaning forward slightly, his arm brushing mine. Nothing, I muttered. Just flipping through channels. Well, that's boring, he teased, grabbing the remote from my hand. Hey, I protested, but he just grinned, scrolling through the options with a casual air. After a few minutes, he settled on an old action movie I vaguely remembered from my childhood. This one's a classic, he said, leaning back into the couch. I nodded, trying to focus on the screen, but all I could think about was how close he was. His arm rested on the back of the couch, his fingers just inches from my shoulder. I shifted in my seat, but the movement only seemed to draw his attention. Relax, Liam, he said softly. You're so tense all the time. I'm fine, I lied, my voice tighter than I intended. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. Are you? The question hung in the air, heavy and intimate. I swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of the way his gaze lingered on me. Yeah, I said, forcing a shrug. Why wouldn't I be? Scott didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and brushed a stray piece of lint off my shoulder. The touch was brief but deliberate, sending a jolt of something unfamiliar through me. You just seem guarded, he said finally, his voice low, like you're carrying more than you let on. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How was I supposed to explain the conflicting emotions swirling inside me? The guilt, the curiosity, the way my chest tightened whenever he was near? Before I could find an answer, the power flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Well, that's inconvenient, Scott said with a chuckle. Hold on, let me grab a flashlight. He stood and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the sound of rain and my racing heartbeat. When he returned, the flashlight cast a soft glow around the room, creating shadows that danced along the walls. Guess it's just us and the storm, he said, setting the flashlight on the coffee table. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Scott sat back down, closer this time, his knee brushing against mine. The proximity was suffocating and electric all at once. Liam, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. It wasn't just the usual warmth or the playful teasing. It was something deeper, something raw. I'm glad you're here, he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. Why? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop it. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. Because I think you see me in a way no one else does. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to look away, to break whatever spell had settled between us, but I couldn't. That's not, I began, but he cut me off. Liam, don't, he said softly. Don't pretend you don't feel it too. My chest tightened, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't articulate. Before I could respond, he reached out and gently brushed his fingers against my cheek. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I shouldn't, he murmured, his hand lingering for just a moment longer before he pulled back. The storm outside raged on, but the room felt eerily still. I sat there, frozen, as Scott leaned back, his expression a mixture of regret and something else I couldn't quite place. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have said anything. He stood and walked toward the stairs, leaving me alone with the storm and the weight of what had just happened. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying his words and the way his touch had made me feel. I didn't know what to do or what it all meant, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a dull gray sky and puddles scattered across the driveway. I stayed in my room longer than usual, dreading the thought of facing Scott. But avoiding him forever wasn't an option, and by mid-morning, hunger forced me downstairs. Scott was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up when I walked in, his face unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice steady but softer than usual. "Morning," I replied, grabbing a glass of water and keeping my eyes on the sink. For a while, neither of us said anything. The tension from the previous night hung heavy in the air, and I could feel his gaze on me as I leaned against the counter, trying to appear unbothered. "About last night," he began, his tone careful. I froze, gripping the glass tighter. "You don't have to say anything," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "I do, though," he said, stepping closer. "I crossed a line, Liam. I never meant to make you uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word echoed in my mind, hollow and inadequate. What I'd felt last night wasn't discomfort. It was confusion, exhilaration, and something far more dangerous. "I get it," I said quickly, setting the glass down with more force than necessary. "Let's just forget it happened." Scott sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter," I snapped, finally looking at him. "You're married to my mom, Scott. This, whatever this is, it can't happen." He held my gaze, his expression a mix of guilt and something else I couldn't place. "You're right," he said after a long pause. "It can't, but that doesn't mean I don't feel it." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to be angry, to tell him he had no right to say that, but the truth was I felt it too. "I need some air," I muttered, brushing past him and heading for the back door. Outside, the cool breeze did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I paced the patio, replaying his words and the way he'd looked at me, so open and unguarded. It wasn't fair. He wasn't supposed to make me feel like this. Wanted, seen, understood. "Liam." His voice startled me, and I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I didn't mean to follow you," he said quickly, his eyes scanning my face. I couldn't leave things like that." I crossed my arms, trying to create some kind of barrier between us. "What do you want from me, Scott?" He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just know that when I'm around you, I can't think straight." My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You shouldn't say things like that," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his gaze locking onto mine. "But I can't help it." For a moment, we stood there, the space between us charged with an intensity one couldn't escape. Then, without thinking, I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "Liam," he began, his voice strained. "Don't," I said, cutting him off. "Don't act like you're the only one struggling with this." The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Scott's eyes widened, and for a second, I thought he might back away. But then his hand reached out, brushing against mine in a touch so fleeting it could have been accidental. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice laced with desperation. I couldn't. I should have, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I closed the remaining gap between us, my breath hitching as his hand cupped my face. The kiss that followed was hesitant at first, almost shy, but it quickly deepened, fueled by weeks of unspoken tension. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done hit me like a tidal wave. Scott stepped back, his face a mixture of regret and longing. "This isn't fair," I said, my voice cracking. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know it's not." We stood there in silence, the weight of our actions settling around us. I wanted to scream, to cry, to take it all back, but I couldn't. "I should go," Scott said finally, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes as he turned and walked back into the house. Left alone, I sank onto the patio steps, my mind racing. I knew this couldn't end well. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and there was no going back now. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Scott and I were like two planets caught in each other's orbit, unable to break free, but terrified of colliding. Mom's return loomed over us like an impending storm, and with it, the inevitability of facing the consequences of what we'd done. I spent most of my time in my room, pretending to be engrossed in books or my phone. But the silence in the house was suffocating, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I couldn't decide which was worse, the fear of being caught or the realization that a part of me didn't regret what had happened. It was late one evening when Scott knocked on my door. His hesitation was obvious in the way his knuckles barely grazed the wood, but the sound still sent a jolt through me. "Liam," he said softly, "can we talk?" I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Letting him in felt like crossing another line, but shutting him out didn't feel right either. With a deep breath, I opened the door. He stood there, his expression guarded but earnest. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low. "I can't keep pretending everything's normal when it's not." I stepped aside, letting him into the room. He sat on the edge of my bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I stayed near the door, unsure of what to say. "I've been thinking about what happened," he began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "And as much as I can't justify it. You're right. This isn't fair. Not to you. Not to your mom. Not to anyone." The words stung more than I expected, even though I knew they were true. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me then, his blue eyes filled with regret. "We stop," he said firmly. "Whatever this is, it has to end. It never should have started." The finality in his tone felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him that what we had felt too real to just walk away from. But deep down, I knew he was right. "Okay," I said, the word catching in my throat. "We stop." He nodded, but neither of us moved. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. "I care about you, Liam," he said finally, his voice breaking. "But I can't be the man who ruins your family. I won't do that to your mom." I swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in my throat. "I get it," I said, though the words felt hollow. He stood then, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, I thought he might reach out to me, but he stopped himself, his hands clenching at his sides. "This isn't easy for me either," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it's the right thing to do." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He hesitated for a moment longer before turning and walking out of the room. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sank onto the bed, the weight of our decision crashing down on me. I wanted to believe that we'd made the right choice, that walking away would somehow fix everything. But the ache in my chest told me otherwise. Mom returned the next day, her cheerful demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension that still lingered between Scott and me. We played our parts well, smiling and laughing as if nothing had changed. But every time our eyes met, the truth hung between us like an unspoken confession. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Scott and I avoided being alone together, and I threw myself into preparations for the upcoming semester. But the memory of that night, and everything that came after, never fully left me. One evening, as I was packing my suitcase, Scott knocked on my door again. This time, his expression was calm, almost resigned. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said, his voice steady. "Goodbye?" I echoed, frowning. "I'm leaving," he explained. "Your mom doesn't know yet, but I've accepted a job in another city. It's better this way, for everyone." His words hit me like a blow, but I forced myself to nod. "I guess this is it then," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "Take care of yourself, Liam." "You too," I replied, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone once again. As the sound of his footsteps faded, I realized that some things couldn't be undone. The lines we'd crossed and the emotions we'd shared would stay with me, even as life moved on. And in the quiet of my room, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever feel that way again.